So we're going to be talking about content filtering and regulation today, which is obviously talking about issues like freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Now, freedom of speech or freedom of expression is sort of increasingly recognised around the world as a universal right, and we can see here that there are lots of declarations of universal rights around the world that have recognised in some form or another freedom of expression. We've got the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the European Convention, the American Convention on Human Rights, the African Charter, and then there's obviously the more recent developments in the US with the Freedom of Connection program in the US, and the EU has a similar system going forward at the moment called the No Disconnect strategy. So we can see that freedom of expression is something that is generally regarded around the world as an important right. But how does this interact with the internet? Well, obviously the internet isn't the source and end point of all freedom of expression around the world, but it does provide a radical change in how we access information and how we can contribute information, how we express ourselves and how we can get our message out to various different people. Internet penetration is growing around the world. Now, the sort of Western nations, highly developed nations, have obviously got relatively strong internet penetration at the moment, but even in places with much lower levels of infrastructure and development, we're getting a high amount of internet penetration, particularly in mobile internet as opposed to the traditional landlines, and also the growth of non-English language content. In the early days of the internet, obviously, there was a lot of English content, a lot of US English content, but a lot less representation of content from other cultures and other countries, and now we're seeing increasingly that there is a huge amount of data out there from the Chinese internet, the Russian internet, across Africa, and obviously the Arabic languages. So growth of non-English language content, we're getting much greater representation around the world. But freedom of expression isn't something that is automatic. It's not an automatic outcome of technological innovation. Technology certainly is an enabler if it is used properly, but you can erode freedom of expression through technologies, either unintentionally or intentionally. And we're seeing this occurring increasingly around the world. Reasons why you might want to regulate content, or why some people might want to regulate content, these are the reasons you see around the world. Obviously, moral reasons are one of the most widely stated. Pornography, child abuse images, hate speech. Religious filtering is very common around the world. Cultural filtering, censorship of language and history. You see this in places like Turkey, where it's very difficult for the Kurdish population to express themselves in their own language because it's not an officially recognised language in Turkey. Informational filtering, where sensitive information can be filtered. Maps of territory can be quite difficult to come across, and some countries want to control that as much as possible. Infrastructural information to do with power supplies, powered plants, communication lines, that kind of thing. Political filtering is very common. The materials put forward by opposition parties in countries that don't have such a strong democratic tradition, texts of political opinions that disagree with the received orthodoxy, and of course lèse majesty, which is the insult towards, for example, the king, or again in Turkey, Kemal Atatürk. It's constitutionally illegal to insult him, and you can go to prison for it. And then you might want to regulate content for sort of more personal reasons, and we do get regulation of websites that promote suicide, self-harm, and things like anorexia. So these are all reasons why information on the internet can and is filtered. So various strategies for doing this. This isn't limited to the internet, but you can limit the production of information, which means that you have to license printers, and this is some of the earliest legislation to do with control of information, is printers having to be licensed in order to operate printing machinery. You had a guild of printers in the UK. Beyond the production, if you're allowing anyone to produce information, you can legislate against display, sale and purchase of information. So you can prevent people from displaying it in their shops, you can make it illegal to sell particular texts or particular piece of information, or you can make it illegal to purchase. And the most common sort of form of this we get now is we can limit access. You can have age limits on content. You can put pornographic magazines up on the top shelf, as you see in newsagents in this country. And in fact, in this country, they're often behind paper wrapping as well on magazines, apparently, I've been told. This sort of walled garden approach where you control all the content in a particular area. It's very interesting, actually, sort of to divert slightly. Walled garden, if you look up the word paradise, etymologically it comes from an old Iranian or an old Persian language word which actually means walled garden, which I think is very interesting when you start thinking about the description we use now of Facebook and Apple's ecosystems as walled gardens. And so Apple is paradise. Also, you can go to a longer extent. Rather than simply limiting access or limiting who can access a particular piece of information, you can block it entirely. You can confiscate texts when you find them, you can filter the internet, or you can refuse to classify films or books or games or any other pieces of information. You can refuse to bring them into your system of acceptable classifications. And then, getting even harder, you can delete information, you can try to destroy books. One of the earliest examples of this that I know about was when the king of Qin unified China in 221 BC. He took all the books of all the previous kingdoms and all of the learning and burnt all of the books, in fact keeping a copy only for himself, and he also burnt the scholars who had memorised the books. So this was a real sort of early example to try and just delete all the information out there that he didn't agree with. Notice and takedown is the internet version of this, where rather than trying to filter access to a website, you go after the person that's hosting it and you take down the website itself. And then obviously we have self-censorship, which is a lot harder to control, but you encourage means whereby people will stop themselves from accessing information or will be scared to access information. So, this is a background to filtering. Regulating content on the internet. Within national borders, this is relatively simple. You have a reasonable amount of control in a nation state over what people in the country can and can't do. And so it's relatively easy to control what people can access and what they can't. However, when you're talking about blocking internationally, when you're going across national borders, that becomes more difficult. You can't control the information that is outside your sphere of control. So when you get to a national border, you can stop people accessing information there or getting outside. You can control the ISPs in your country to stop them from allowing people access to information. But it's very difficult to regulate what's going on around the world outside of your sphere of control. This doesn't stop people from trying. There have been attempts by judges to block content internationally to stop people in a particular country from accessing content outside of that country, but it doesn't have a great sort of record in history. Filtering of the internet is widespread around the world. It's something that pretty much every nation does, to some extent or other. Now, some countries obviously do it a lot, and they're the very famous ones for doing it. China, Iran come to mind. But Western liberal democracies are not paragons of virtue in this respect. Filtering is something that happens in all of these countries. There we go. So just a quick taste. This isn't a comprehensive list, but a few examples of liberal democracies that are known to filter content. Australia had proposed legislation in 2008 that allowed a particular branch of the government to order ISPs to remove adult content or content considered obscene. Like most filtering regimes, the classification decisions were secret. They were not available to be viewed. We'll go into a little bit more detail as to why that is later. But what was interesting about the case in Australia was that in 2009, a copy of the filtering list was leaked to the internet. And when people looked at it, they found that it included things like gambling sites that weren't illegal and weren't obscene. They found links to YouTube videos, which has a relatively strong sort of adult filter anyway. It found regular pornographic sites, not criminally obscene or violent pornography, but regular pornography. And also, there were legitimate businesses. There was a dentist in this list, who, for some reason at some point apparently had malware on his website, which was serving viruses or spam. He'd been added to the filter list, but without transparency there was no way for him to know that he'd been added to the filter list, and so there was no way for him to get unblocked. Now, this was challenged in Australia, and the legislation was largely dropped in 2010. It's in a kind of legal black hole at the moment. But the powers that be in Australia are still quite keen for this kind of legislation, and there is a chance that it will be revived in the medium term. I think the current view is that by 2013 this law could sort of raise its head again. The Council of Europe Cybercrime Treaty has a provision for hate speech, which is any written material, any image or any other representation of ideas or theories which advocates, promotes or incites hatred, discrimination or violence against any individual or group of individuals based on race, colour, descent or national or ethnic origin, as well as religion if used as pretext for any of these factors. And material which denies, minimises, approves of or justifies crimes of genocide or crimes against humanity. So this is at the European level. These criteria can classify speech as hate speech, which can have it classified as cybercrime. Physical blocking attempts actually within Europe. In the UK, we have a scheme called variously called BT Clean Feed, which was the technical measure for blocking content. It's regulated by a self-regulatory body called the Internet Watch Foundation, the IWF, who are a non-government organisation, but they were founded in response to attempts by the government to legislate filtering in this country. So basically what happened was the government said to the ISPs, either you self-regulate and start to block child pornography and things like it, or we will regulate you, we will make it law. And so in response to this, a self-regulatory mechanism was set up. The IWF, which is a non-profit, was founded to judge content that needed to be filtered on the internet. Its original mandate was child abuse images, and the major ISPs in this country all implement this list. They will all block the content on this list. It's not mandatory. You can get to ISPs that don't filter this list, but obviously it's very difficult to find out in some senses if they do or not, because you don't want to have to check child pornography sites just to see if your internet connection is unfiltered. In France, a few years ago, a bill called the LOPSI 2 bill was brought in. Now, the LOPSI 2 bill was quite interesting because it was a very broad security bill. It was a bill that covered all forms of terrorist legislation, various types of cybercrime. But what it also included was censorship of obvious child pornography. And it allowed ISPs to remove or filter content that was of obvious child pornography without needing to go to a court, without having any kind of oversight. Now, this law was actually successful, and I did some work with a colleague of mine on looking at the debates that surrounded this law. And one of the factors that came out of this was this LOPSI 2 bill was horrible. It contained a huge number of provisions on a variety of topics related to security, many of which were viewed as unconstitutional and were challenged in the Constitutional Court in France. And to some extent, the censorship and child pornography aspects of this law were simply swept under the carpet because there were so many other horrible things going on in this law that nobody even thought to challenge it on censorship grounds. So this law was successful. By contrast, in Germany, there was initially a self-regulatory agreement by internet service providers to filter content on the internet. This led to calls for a specific blocking law. Now, the calls for the law came from the internet service providers. And the reason that the internet service providers wanted there to be a specific law was because if they were required to filter content, if they were being asked to filter content, there were concerns that they would be liable for filtering that content. That if they did it wrong, they could be sued, or if they, if they filtered something that they weren't supposed to filter, they could be sued, or vice versa. And so this eventually became a proposed law. It created a lot of media debate in Germany. There were lots of debates about whether it would be effective, whether it would be efficient, whether it would be constitutional. But in the end, the law was defeated, and there's various theories as to why that happened. At the EU level, from the technological side, there is a project called SERCAMP, which is producing a filtering system on the UK model, on the IWF model, whereby police would maintain a centralised database of content that should be filtered. This involves, it's led by Norway, it involves Finland and a few other countries, I can't remember which. There's 8 countries around the EU that are involved with this SERCAMP project. Very famously, from 2000, a group of Jewish students in France brought an action against Yahoo, who at the time was selling things on an online auction site. And a group of Jewish students asked the French courts to block the sale of Nazi memorabilia to French users. Now, Yahoo's response to this was that it complied. It removed the ability to see these items from the French site. But they also went to a Californian court to declare that this ruling had no actual legally binding effect on them, because they didn't want to be sort of legally beholden to the French court on this aspect. They did initially get that ruling, but it was overturned on appeal. And interestingly enough, when we start to talk about the effectiveness of this blocking, the French court experts gave the claim that such a block would be 70 to 80% effective at preventing people from accessing this kind of content. And this is one of the ongoing complaints with filtering, is how effective is it? How well can you stop somebody from getting to the content you don't want them to see? We'll see about that later. I've spoken a little bit about the Internet Watch Foundation and the BT Clean Feed system, but basically the Internet Watch Foundation oversees a list of banned sites. Now, the way that it gets banned sites is by a hotline. If you're browsing the internet and you stumble across some child pornography, then you can phone up the Internet Watch Foundation and say, I found this content, I believe that it is illegal, and I would like you to add it to the watch list. Now, not many people know about this, and at the same time, not many people stumble across child pornography on the internet, as far as I'm aware, but it does happen. Now, the Internet Watch Foundation's initial mandate was for child abuse images, and there's a terminology point here, which is the differentiation between child pornography and child abuse images. The Internet Watch Foundation and similar projects refuse to use the term child pornography because they feel that it legitimizes child abuse images as pornographic. And so they insist on the use of the word child abuse images. They view this as a permanent record of sexual abuse of children. So the original mandate of the Internet Watch Foundation was to block and prevent access to child abuse images. Shortly after their sort of inception and the running of the IWF, their mandate expanded to include material that was not of children but that was criminally obscene within the UK's understanding of criminally obscene. It has also expanded to include incitement to racial hatred, and they also have a category which is simply other. So anything that you feel might be illegal, you can report it to the IWF, and they will give it their expert opinion and add it to their block list if they feel that it does violate this other category. Unfortunately, by their nature, they cannot give you access to what's on the filter list. It is viewed as giving people a roadmap to access child abuse images, criminally obscene content. And so you can't see what's on the filter list, and this is a feature of filtering approaches around the world. So it's impossible to see what's in this other category. Now, the IWF only maintain a list. They have a list of websites, and they say this content is illegal and should be filtered in the UK. From a technological end, this is achieved largely through a system developed by BT called Clean Feed. I'll go into detail a little bit later when I look at the technologies as to how Clean Feed works. But what's important in this respect is that a researcher at the University of Cambridge called Richard Clayton in 2005 used the BT Clean Feed system just by accessing it as a normal user to reverse engineer the list of banned content. He found that by tweaking the Clean Feed system, by communicating with it in a particular way, he could actually use it to reveal what content was filtered, or at least to help him find out what content was filtered. And this is to some extent a criticism of the entire approach of filtering content. It's that if you can detect what is filtered, then to a technically skilled user, you are providing them with this secret list of banned content. Now, the slippery slope that occurs here is that because clean feed, the system is now in place, or equivalents to the clean feed system are in place across roughly 95% of the internet connections in the UK, the 5 major ISPs. The clean feed system, as a technological system for filtering content, has now been ordered by the courts to include specific copyright infringing sites. This includes the Pirate Bay and also a site called Newsbin. So on the majority of UK internet connections, you cannot get to the Pirate Bay. Again, you can go to ISPs that don't implement this system, and you can still get to the Pirate Bay. So going across the Atlantic, censorship efforts in the US were repeatedly tried in the 1990s particularly, and were repeatedly ruled unconstitutional. The First Amendment in the United States is a very strong barrier against this kind of censorship. There were particular problems with the understanding of community standards. Many of the laws include filtering of content which is considered to be obscene according to community standards, which is a very sort of broad terminology and very open to interpretation. And so these were often found to be insufficient. Obviously, the First Amendment supports freedom of expression and makes it very difficult to block content of this nature. And there are also concerns about proportionality. Now, particularly, a law in Pennsylvania, which was struck down in 2004, found that 400 blocked sites, according to their list, actually caused collateral damage to about 1 million other sites if these sites were to be blocked, due to the nature of the blocking and the means by which they would be blocked. It was also found that it was easy to circumvent, and again, this is a feature of internet filtering, is that it tends to be very easy to circumvent for dedicated users. And at the same time, the particular Pennsylvania law, which was aimed at child abuse images, again, they found no evidence that this act has reduced exploitation or abuse of children. So these laws have a tough time in the US. And a very sort of quite famous and appropriately motivational quote from the ACLU is, "Just as the strength of the internet is chaos, so the strength of our liberty depends upon the chaos and cacophony of the unfettered speech the First Amendment protects." And then obviously, in the last year, we have SOPR and PIPA. I imagine most people are at least familiar with the names of SOPR and PIPA, but these were proposed bills respectively in the US House of Representatives and the Senate. They focused on intellectual property and to a large extent were focused on the takedown of platforms hosting copyright infringing content. They allowed for foreign domain names to be seized, foreign hosts to be blocked, if they were hosting, if they were sort of dedicated to hosting copyright infringing content. They also included provisions to prevent US businesses from doing business with the companies that were hosting this content, which allowed you to stop things like payment processing and various other things. This produced a massive wave of protests across the internet population in general, particularly the US internet population, and most notably large sites including Wikipedia and Reddit engaged in blackouts where they shut down their websites and said, this is what could happen if you allow SOPR and PIPA to pass. And so these bills are now in a kind of legislative hell somewhere in the United States. I think they haven't actually been thrown out entirely, but they are. They're not going to appear anytime soon. Or if they do, they will appear in a different form with a different name. But this is just the legislative side. This is regulation. And what you often find is that it's the private side of censorship, the private side of filtering, that is more pervasive and more difficult to fight. In the US, school and library filters are mandated by the Child Internet Protection Act. Now, this isn't 100% accurate. Actually, school and libraries that accept funding from the government are mandated to implement filtering according to the Child Internet Protection Act. And I think, if I can remember my figures correctly, roughly a third of libraries in 2007 refused funding on the basis that they didn't want to filter the internet connections in their libraries. But the NCMEC in the United States, which is an autonomous, semi-autonomous agency, provides a list of URLs to ISPs which enables them to take down or block material. This is very similar to the IWF list, the IWF approach. The difference is that it is entirely within the private sphere. This is entirely done privately, and includes sexually explicit images of prepubescent children. The majority of ISPs have implemented the system. To a large extent, the attempts made here are to get in contact with the hosting providers and to take down the content rather than simply to block it. But blocking does occur. The interaction with a semi-state operated list or a police operated list, like you've seen in SERCAMP, is that ISPs in the US are particularly keen to avoid being seen as actors of the state. And so there is strong resistance to anything that has any kind of government handle on it. In practice, this is quite a subtle distinction, but I think it makes a significant difference between the political landscape in the US and the EU. So the most common approach for filtering in the US is something that was pioneered by AOL. And they use a method based on hashes of child abuse images. Now, hashing is a cryptographic technique. I'm not sure if I covered this in my last lecture, but hashing is a cryptographic technique that allows you to create a unique signature of a particular image or file. You can think of it as almost like the DNA of a file. And what it means is you can take a particular file and extract a short signature from it, and that allows you to recognize that file if you see it again. And what AOL do is that they store the hashes of child abuse images, and content can be checked against this hash. If it matches, then you can block the image, report it to the police, report it to the appropriate authorities. And if it doesn't match, then you can let the image through on the internet connection. One of the sort of concerns with this was that this applies not just to URLs that you're visiting on your website, but AOL were using this to scan your emails to see if you were sending child abuse images in your emails to your friends. And the concern here was that people have a certain sort of visceral dislike of having their private emails scanned, even if it is being done automatically by a machine. There is still the viewpoint that this is intercepting and looking at your private communications. So the AOL-based approach not only blocks the communication if it discovers an image, but it also provides a report to the police or the appropriate body. Moving away from just the US, we see search engine filtering around the world. Now, search engines are the gateway to the internet for a lot of users now. Very few users actually type a URL into the URL bar of their web browser. If you start looking at the top Google search terms, you'll find that one of the top Google search terms is actually Facebook. Because what happens is people open up their web browser and it goes to the Google homepage and they want to go to Facebook, so they type Facebook into Google and then click on the link. And this is how most people use the internet these days. So filtering search engines is a very powerful approach to some extent. Famously in China, the search engines are known to remove contentious results. If you search for Tiananmen Square on the computer in front of you, there's a good chance that you will see tanks and a man with a plastic bag standing in front of them. If you search for that in China, you will see a very large square in Beijing called Tiananmen Square, notably devoid of tanks. Tibetan independence is something that the Chinese government is not very keen on, and if you search for it in the Chinese search engines such as Baidu, then you will not find anything of any great interest, and also the religious movement, the Falun Gong. But again, this isn't just something that happens in China or Iran or Saudi Arabia. German search engines have a voluntary code. It's not mandated by the government. They have a voluntary code to remove hate speech. We saw a definition of hate speech earlier. And Holocaust denial, which is also illegal in Germany. And obviously Google US will filter results where there's been a DMCA report against the website, so copyright infringing content. Google are very good about this in that they will say this list includes search results that have been filtered according to DMCA requests, and they will give you a link to the DMCA request itself by linking you off to a website called Chilling Effects, which maintains a database of DMCA requests. But we see the search engine filtering, again, not just in China, not just in Iran, but in Germany, France, the UK, well, I don't know about the UK, but certainly the US. But one thing that Google and some other companies, notably Twitter, have started to do quite nicely is to implement blocking based on the country in which you access the content. So if you go to google.com in the UK, you will typically be taken to google.co.uk because they can tailor the results for you more effectively. So if you search for something on Google within the UK, Google, rather than filtering their search results across the entire world, will just filter it if you're at a google.co.uk domain. So if you're at google.de for the German site and you search for Holocaust denial materials, then they will filter that content to you because you are accessing it in Germany. But if you go to Google in the US, then you can still access the same content because it's not illegal there. So this is a nicely sensitive way to meet your legal obligations within a country and not have to compromise your search results for the rest of the world.
Does it matter on your physical location? Like if I went to the German Google right now and I'm located in the UK, would they automatically switch it over?
It's kind of a, the way it's done is that if you go to google.de and search for Holocaust denial, then you will have your search results filtered. So you can go to Google, you should be able to go to google.de right there and search for it, and you will have your results blocked. But the way that Google does it is it detects where you are when you make a request. So if you go to google.com, it will automatically redirect you to google.de if you're in Germany. And the reason they do this is for convenience. This is, you get German language sites, you get German interface with Google. But what Google have done very nicely is if you go to google.com/NCR, /no country recognition, then you'll get a google.com result. And that will happen if you're in Germany. So if you're in Germany and you go to google.com/NCR, then it will not geolocate you, it will not take you to google.de, and it will not filter your search results. So what this does is it provides a user with an option to bypass this minimal level of filtering. This is something that I support very, very strongly. Right. We're going to delve a little bit down now into the technical side of internet filtering around the world, particularly from the point of view of state-level internet filtering as opposed to private internet filtering, but this does apply to private systems as well. There are various ways that you can filter or block an internet connection. The first of them is what's called DNS poisoning. Now, the DNS system, I think we will have covered this in the first lecture, but basically, as a quick recap, it's effectively the phone book of the internet. When you type google.com into your web browser, the computer needs an IP address to work with. It can't work with google.com. So what it does is it goes to a DNS server, looks up the number that is associated with google.com, and returns the IP address and takes you where you want to go. So the first level of filtering, the easiest level of filtering, the simplest method of filtering, is to simply poison those results. If somebody wants to go to google.com and you want to stop them going to google.com, then you can intercept things at the DNS level. You can tell the DNS server to return no result. There is no google.com. Or a lie, a fake IP address that doesn't match google.com. It's very simple, quite crude, but doesn't require a lot of resources. The second approach, slightly more sort of sophisticated, is what's generally referred to as IP header filtering. Now, when we looked at the IP packets in the first lecture, there was a header section and a body section in any packet of data going across the internet. The header contains little bits of information like what's the destination, what's the IP address of the destination, and various other pieces of information. But the important thing here is which IP address am I trying to contact? IP header filtering, therefore, allows you to block access to computers based on the number, based on the IP address that you're trying to get to. So it doesn't matter if somebody finds out what the IP address of Google is, you will intercept that IP address and stop the person accessing it. Now that's fine, but it doesn't let you filter, for example, somebody searching for Holocaust denial in Germany. You could block Google in Germany, but you couldn't block, a keyword. And that's the next level of filtering, probably the most complex type of filtering. which is where rather than just looking at the header of an IP packet, which you can think of as like the envelope on a letter, IP content filtering looks inside the envelope, reads the letter, sees if there's anything you don't like, and then blocks based on that. This is what's also called DPI, or Deep Packet Inspection. And this allows you to block in a very sophisticated manner, very flexible, but it tends to require a lot of computation because you have to look at every packet that is going across the internet from your country or on your network, scan it all, and then decide whether to block. So it takes a bit of resources. And then what you can also do is you can combine these methods. So you can decide that you're never going to filter Google, so you always let everything go through to Google. But if you go to a specialist website, then they might recognise the DNS and pass you off to a more intelligent filter. So they might recognise the DNS of holocaustdenial.com, and then if you actually search for specific information there, they'll pass you up to the DPI level and search for keywords. So you can get to the holocaustdenial.com main page, but if you start looking for detailed information, they can stop you doing that. So you can combine these methods. Takedown, we've already mentioned a little bit. Social pressure is something else. These are non-technical approaches. Social pressure, legislation to filtering. So just to give you a sort of, just to illustrate this is your DNS filtering. Sorry, the writing's quite small, I don't know if you can see it. But basically, you search for some target domain, target.com is what I've got written here, and it goes off to the DNS server and comes back. That's how a DNS lookup works. And then later on, you go all the way across the internet and get the information. But the first stage is this DNS lookup of what is the domain name, what is target.com's IP address. And what happens after this is that you get the IP address back and it spirals across the internet to the target computer and returns what you want to get. This is basic stuff from the first lecture. What happens with DNS poisoning is that when you ask for target.com from your DNS server, it returns an invalid result, not the IP address you were looking for, which takes you to some other computer entirely, or maybe no computer. To move up to header filtering, you get the correct IP address back from your DNS server, but as you try and go across this network of networks, the internet, to get to your target, at this point they block you based on the IP address you were given. Alternatively, they could block you on a particular service, the particular port that you were trying to access. When you start looking at content filtering, the DNS is valid, and it doesn't block you based on your IP, but when it determines a particular word or phrase in your connection, it blocks you there. So this is how this kind of stuff happens. And then proxy filtering is where they detect you, take you through a censorship authority that does more intelligent monitoring of your communications, and then it passes you on if it was valid and blocks you if it wasn't valid. So, the limitations of these approaches. Well, there's a trade-off between the subtlety of the approach, how sort of tightly you want to be able to block and how intelligently you want to be able to block, and how much computational power you're going to need to do it. And this is particularly severe when you're talking about not some little ISP somewhere, but an entire country. Particularly if you're talking about a country like China, where there's 500 and something million internet users. And if you're going to manage and design a system that's going to work like this, then you've got all the administrative and organisational burdens of maintaining filter lists and maintaining the infrastructure to do this. So, this has been a bit of a brief overview of filtering and how it works, but what I thought I would do, because I've gone quite quickly, so I've got quite a bit of time left, is give you a case study of some research I did looking at China's internet filtering. Now, China's national internet filter is called, in China it's called the Golden Shield. It's known internationally as the Great Firewall. It's probably the most advanced filtering technology in the world today. It's certainly the largest. It's not necessarily the most oppressive. If you look at the Citizen Lab report that was done a few years ago, the Access Denied book, then their judgment is that Saudi Arabia at that time was the most oppressive in terms of what it filtered and how many different types of things it filtered. But China are certainly leading the field in the sheer technology and the sheer size of it. The Golden Shield uses everything that we've talked about today and more. It has DPI analysis of keywords. It does active blocking of particular services that try to circumvent internet filtering. It can recognise the protocols that you're using, so it can block you if you're using Firefox, but not if you're using Internet Explorer, that kind of thing. They can monitor traffic on the wire to see if you're doing something that you shouldn't be. They can manipulate data on the wire so that you request a certain page from a website and it comes back with certain words changed or blanked out. This kind of thing can happen. They can do this within the country. They can also do it at the border of the country. And just to let you in on the current rumours that's surrounding this kind of stuff, there is some evidence to suggest that the majority of internet traffic in China is being transparently passed through an IP version 6 network for extra filtering. And the reason that they do this is because it's invisible to IP version 4. So your average internet user who's using, we talked about this in the first lecture, the old IP version 4, they can't physically see the links in an IP version 6 network unless they have it enabled. There's some evidence that China are doing this kind of transparent filtering before anything gets out, so but just a rumour. But what we wanted to look at when we started to poke at the Great Firewall was, we talk about the Great Firewall, we talk about China's internet filtering. Is this centralised? Is this homogeneous? Is this something that occurs across China? Is it always the same? Or is it more distributed? Is it more broken down? Is it more sort of decentralised? And the way that we chose to do this was to look at their DNS filtering. Now, there are various types of filtering going on in China, but it's very difficult to see what is going on in China if you're not in China. Obviously, you know, if I'm using the internet in Oxford, I'm not going to be subject to Beijing's internet filtering, or at least I hope not. So what we did was we were trying to think of ways that we could remotely investigate what was going on in China. And not just in China, but all over China. So we wanted to see whether somebody in Beijing would get the same amount of filtering as somebody in Shanghai, as the same amount of filtering as somebody in Chengdu, same amount of filtering as somebody over in the West where there's a lot of political unrest. And we know that there's differences in filtering because different regions get their internet connections cut off entirely when there are large riots. So, without a good way to look at IP header filtering or deep packet inspection, we decided to focus on the very simple DNS server filtering because DNS servers are located all across China, everyone's using them, and they tend to talk to you if you talk to them. So you can do a DNS request from the UK to a Chinese DNS server and see what result it gives you. You can look up Facebook from a Beijing-based DNS server and see if it gives you a valid IP address. In order to investigate this, we went to the Asia Pacific Network Information Center and asked for a list of every DNS server they knew about in China. Actually, we just asked them for everything they had, and we pulled out the DNS servers in China. We then went to a project run by the Harvard Berkman Center called Herdict that monitors blocked websites around the world. And they give you a country-by-country breakdown of the most reported blocked sites in a particular country. So we picked the top websites from China, and then we simply, for all the DNS servers we could find in China, we simply went to them and asked them, what is the result when I ask you for a lookup of this site? Now, when a DNS server is talking to you, there are various things that it can respond. The first thing that it can do is it can say, I'm not even a DNS server, which is quite strange because in order to do that, it has to have told you it was a DNS server to give you that response. But this is something that it can actually say. I'm still a little bit baffled as to why that exists, but it's a possibility. Another thing it can do is just ignore you. It can stonewall. You know, you send it a request and it just sits there and gives you no response. So it times out. Slightly more sort of dramatically, it can say there is no such domain. So if you ask it for some random string of characters.com, then if that domain doesn't exist, it will tell you no such domain. And obviously what's interesting is if you ask it for facebook.com and it says there's no such domain. Slightly sneakily, it can also misdirect you. You can ask it for facebook.com and it says, sure, the IP address is x.y.z.w. But it could give you the wrong IP address. So you try to connect to that IP address and you don't get to Facebook, you get something else, something that isn't Facebook. And then it could just give you a genuine result, which is nice in a way, but it can be a bit disappointing when you're looking for filtering. So, without any further ado, here are some results from some experiments that we did across China. Now, Twitter is known to be filtered across China. This is a list of the top 10 domains we found that gave us fake IP address results. These are ones where we said, twitter.com, what's its IP address? Well, we saw that all of them gave us some response. One of them gave us no answer, sorry, as in none of them said there is no such twitter.com. All of them said there is some response for twitter.com. Some of them claimed not to be name servers, that's reasonable. A few of them timed out. We made every effort to make sure that they didn't time out just because of a network problem. We tried them multiple times. But what we did find was out of the 187, I think it was 187 DNS servers that we queried, 165 of them gave us an IP address that was not Twitter's IP address. They lied to me, which is very hurtful. The same was true, and so you can see for various things here, we've got youtube.com, we've got the Tor project, which is an anti-censorship and anonymous communication tool. We've got tibet.net, which you can imagine what that's about. Facebook is blocked in China very famously. All of these were giving us false IP addresses that didn't match what they really were supposed to be. But what they didn't tend to do was say there's no such domain as Facebook, there's no such domain as Twitter. These are the top 10 domains that did, in some cases, respond with there is no such domain. And what we see is that, I don't know really, this VOA News is Voice of America, which is known to be filtered. But if we look at the top 10 on how many times they said there's no such domain, we only see 3 or 4 across all of China saying there's no such domain as that. It's much more common for the DNS server to suddenly start pretending that it's not a DNS server. It's a lot more common to just receive no answer at all, or for the system to time out. But again, we did see true IP addresses for all of these sites, and what that implies, perhaps, is that it's filtered at other levels. It's maybe filtered at the borders of China. So they let you get the correct IP address, but then when you try to connect to it, they'll block you at a later stage. China, it's a big place. Here's all of it, including contested regions. These are the cities for which we had DNS servers. The more geographically minded may note that there's a lot of east and not a lot of west. That's because this is the distribution of cities in China. There's a lot more population on this side, and a lot more major cities on this side. DNS servers tending to be run by ISPs are likely to be in the big cities. So this is a zoomed in view where I've cut off the west. So we've got a reasonably good coverage. These are various different cities, and we have different numbers of DNS servers in all of them. We had about 75 to 80 in Beijing, and in various of these cities we only had one DNS server that would talk to us. So if we want to see the servers that were willing to lie to me when I asked for the top domains, this is roughly a sort of visualization of what this kind of responses we got. Now, the bigger a circle is on this map, the more DNS servers we had, the more different DNS servers there were that were willing to talk to us at all. There is a scale from green to red. Red means they were more likely to lie to me, green means they were more likely to be honest. So we can see that, in general, if you were asking for a blocked website in Beijing, there's a good chance that the DNS server would give you a bad IP address. If you did the same thing in Shanghai, there's a good chance you would find the IP address. This doesn't mean that you would be able to get to the website, but you would at least have a valid IP address for it. For the other bit of information I just gave you, the no such domain results, it looks a bit more like this. And what this represents is that none of them really were likely to lie to you. if you asked for a none of them were likely to say there's no such domain. If you ask for Facebook, they'll give you some result. It might be incorrect, but they'll give you some result. Unless you're down here in Guangzhou. And when you sort of flip between these, you can see that Shanghai particularly is quite permissive in this sense. In that you're likely to get some valid information, which implies that the filtering is going on somewhere else. In Beijing, well, they're more likely to send you off in the wrong direction. But just to pull out some specific points of interest from these experiments, one thing you might expect is that if a DNS server was going to give you a fake result of some kind, give you a result that wasn't just a straight IP address, you might expect them to just do that for every site that they were going to block. You know, Facebook is blocked, so we'll lie to you. Twitter is blocked, so we'll lie to you. But what we found was that they were quite inconsistent. And this is illustrated by the examples here. For a particular server in Beijing that we asked 68 times on our list of websites, it would say, it would give us no answer. But then 13 times, it would give us an IP address that was misleading. You know, why would it not always give us no answer? Why would it not always give us a misleading IP address? And, well, I won't talk about the local host redirection, I don't think that's important. But what this sort of represents is that these IP addresses, these approaches, perhaps grew up in a more organic sense. This isn't some centralized policy. This isn't being done at a centralized location. These are people more likely to be saying, okay, we've just got an order in to redirect Facebook. Do something naughty in the DNS to make that happen. But one particularly interesting result we got was related to the Tor project. Now, the Tor project is as I've said, it's a tool for circumventing internet filtering, amongst other things, which means that the Chinese government, by and large, are not particularly keen on it, and they don't particularly want their users, their citizens, to access it. But what we found across all of China, across various servers across China, was that when we asked for torproject.org, which is the Tor project's website, different servers run by different companies in different cities across China gave us fake IP addresses. And when we looked up what those IP addresses actually were, they all redirected to tonycastro.net. Tony Castro. Tony Castro is, he looks like a very nice guy. He wrote a book about a baseball player, and if you go to, well, you can go to his website. I'm sure the Chinese government won't mind. He wrote this book, but what we see is that for no apparent reason, and I've looked into this quite deeply, locations all across China, Beijing, Hefei, Chongqing, Shanghai, all of them took us to places that resolved to tonycastro.com. Not the same IP address, different IP addresses, but that all resolved back to domains owned by Tony Castro. I have no idea why they do this. My one theory is that there are 10 letters in Tor project and 10 letters in Tony Castro, and they both begin TO. And that is the only link I can see between Tor project and tonycastro.net. So anyway, a mystery. But what this implies is that there is some level of correlation across China with this filtering. This isn't something that is uniform across China. It clearly varies. It's clearly done in different ways. But for some reason, these different DNS servers across China, with different organisations and different policies and different ways of responding, all of them were taking us to Tony Castro, which means that there was something going on. So,
did you find other instances where where they were redirected to the same place, and were they always redirected to other valid IP addresses, or sometimes was it just?
Yeah, no, good question. Yes, is the short answer. For a start, they will always take, if they give you an IP address, it will always be valid. There's not really there isn't really scope for not giving you a real IP address, right? So an IP address will always be in this representation, it will always be 4 numbers from 255, from 0 to 255. So they will always give you valid numbers. We did find correlation across China. But what we didn't find was any convincing reason for what the correlation was. We never saw anything as strong as the Tony Castro correlation. Oh, I like that term, Tony Castro. We did find various servers across China in different places giving you the same result for domain names across China. When we looked at where these IP addresses were, we were geolocating the IP addresses, which sounds more impressive than it is. You just have a database and you look up the IP address in the database and it gives you a city. We found them in UK, Azerbaijan, Germany, Switzerland. We did find some in Beijing, which is what you might expect. If you're going to give somebody a fake IP address, they're trying to get to something the government doesn't want them to access. So if I were doing this, I would say, right, let's send them to a server in Beijing, and then that can log everything that they do. So we can see we can see who's trying to get to banned content. But we didn't see that. We saw it going off to IP addresses all over the world. One theory that we have with this is that I don't think there are many Chinese citizens who are going to be avidly browsing TonyCastro.net. So this is likely to be an unusual destination, and it could be that this is a surveillance tool, as in if a router in China sees somebody going to TonyCastro.net, they know that connection was originally intended for the Tor project, and so they can note that down or block it or do something else with it. So you can think of this as sort of almost like tagging someone's connection. That's one theory, but it's certainly not something I have any strong evidence for. But yes, there is correlation across China. And what this implies is that there is some level of centralization, but not a complete level of centralization. This isn't something that is just managed. And so really the whole purpose of that little diversion, apart from the fact that it's some research I did and I thought it was fun, is that when you do think about filtering, when you do think about content filtering, internet filtering, try not to think of it as this solid block of China does this, Spain does that, Saudi Arabia does this. There's differentiation there, and it can change over time, and it can change depending on where you are. There's also some evidence that China may intercept communications from outside China and tweak them on the wire. So it could be that if I asked for TonyCastro.net in China, I would get a different result from when I ask for it outside of China. When I bounce my connection into China. So anyway, nearly there. So points for discussion. We'll have these later, but I'll just go over them now. Can controls on the chaos and cacophony of the internet exist that are consistent with protections for freedom of expression? How effective are current and future blocking technologies likely to be? Is censorship better imposed by the public sector or the private sector? And if blocking is required by law, how can accountability and transparency be achieved? And I will finish there, and I would suggest that we have a 5-minute break and then come back and have your presentations. So.